Okay, hello and welcome both to our in-person audience and our online audience. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Dr. Amy Krupel and I'm the director of the UF Center for European Studies. Our center is both a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence and a Title VI National Resource Center for Europe. Although the center is housed in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, it is a multidisciplinary area and language study that serves the entire campus and off-campus community. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's discussion will be recorded and will be available on both the UF-CES website and the Bob Graham Center websites. We will have a Q&A session following the presentation. For the in-person participants, we will have a microphone that we'll pass around. For those who are online, there is a chat function at the bottom of your screen, I am told, and you can enter your questions there and have them read aloud for here, and they will be monitored. I want to thank everyone again for joining us today. This presentation is part of the UF Jean Monnet Center of Excellence EU in the News Public Forum, and we're here today to discuss transatlantic community in the aftermath of Russia's aggression, what's next. And this was presented in support, with support of the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union, and is today being co-sponsored by the Bob Graham Center for Public Service, which is where you all are. So thank you to them. We have two discussants or presenters today, as well as a moderator informally and as needed. Our informal as needed moderator will be Dr. Matt Jacobs, who is the director of the Bob Graham Center. And our first panelist will be Mr. Kofi, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, who focuses on foreign policy issues. Prior to joining Hudson, Mr. Kofi worked at the Heritage Foundation as a research fellow and director of the Foreign Policy Center. He previously served at the UK Ministry of Defence as a senior special advisor to the British Defence Secretary and was the first non-UK citizen appointed by the Prime Minister to serve in that capacity. He also worked for the House of Commons as an advisor on defence and security issues for the Conservative Party. His work in British politics followed his service to the United States as a commissioned officer in the Army, and he is a veteran of the war in Afghanistan, where he was awarded the Bronze Star Medal. Our second panelist, Dr. Zachary Selden, is an associate professor at UF in the Department of Political Science. Until December of 2006, Dr. Selden was the director of the Defense and Security Committee of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly based in Brussels. And from 2000 to 2003, he was an international affairs analyst in the National Security Division of the Congressional Budget Office. Prior to that, he was a research director for emerging threats at Business Executives for National Security, a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. Before you leave today, we ask that you sign up. There's a sign-up sheet in the back. If you're here for Dr. Selden's class, you got to sign up to get credit. He won't remember your face. If you're here for any other reason, and we hope many of you are, we ask that you sign up so that we can inform our sponsors and our funders of the number of people who were here and your backgrounds. We promise not to spam you too much with information about other events. And speaking of other events, particularly if you are interested in the broad topic of Ukraine, the Center for European Studies has a virtual event. These flyers are in the back there on the table. We have an upcoming virtual event on Wednesday, also moderated by Dr. Selden, called Fueling the War in Ukraine, with panelists focusing on the role of energy and energy politics in the current conflict. We also have a number of other events that are more or less related to this, and you can find out more information both on the flyer and on our website. And while I don't know them all specifically, I'm quite confident that the Bob Graham Center also has a broad array of events that will be of interest to you, and I encourage you to visit their website as well. And with that, I'm going to step away and let Mr. Kofi take the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that kind introduction. In Washington, when we want to drive up attendance, we normally offer Chick-fil-A, but I guess getting credit, school credit, class credit also is a motivating factor as well. It's great to be here in Gainesville, where it's nice and warm, and I want to particularly thank the Center for European Studies and the Bob Graham Center for Public Service for putting together this event and for inviting me here to speak, and especially for the Center for European Studies with all the logistics and the patience required to help get me down here for this event. I wanted to give a brief overview of how we got to where we are today in Ukraine, then talk about what the year 2023 is going to entail with the war, why it matters for the US, how Russia's invasion of Ukraine has changed the geopolitical landscape and the transatlantic community in a way not seen since the Second World War, and then talk a little bit about what is next. I do not believe that the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. I think that the Soviet Union is actually still collapsing today, and if you look, the evidence is all around. I think that history has the ability to condense time. And when historians 200 years from now write about the era that is the collapse of the Soviet Union, they will identify Russia's February of 2022 invasion of Ukraine as the most consequential act and probably the final act of the collapse. And if you look around the region since 1991, whether it's the ongoing Russian military presence in Transnistria, Russia's invasion of Georgia and continued occupation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in 2008, the ongoing skirmishes and tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Karabakh, the border clashes between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, or Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, and of course its large-scale invasion last year, the Soviet Union is still collapsing today. Now, on the night of February 23rd of last year, I was laying in bed with my smartphone, of course, looking at Google Maps. And I was looking at, because I'm a nerd, I was looking at the border with Ukraine and Russia on Google Maps. And I noticed, on Google Maps, if there's heavy traffic, it's like red, and if it's really heavy, it's dark red, and if it's just moderate traffic, it's green. Well, from Belgorod to Kharkiv, Belgorod is a major city along the Ukrainian border inside Russia that served as a staging point, and Kharkiv is Ukraine's second largest city close to the Russian border. On that main road, it was maroon. It was dark red, and it was about 4 a.m. local time, and I thought to myself, "Wow, is this the invasion that's happening right now?" And you can see it on Google Maps. And I thought, wow, 3 decades ago, intelligence analysts would have given anything to have this level of real-time analysis to consider. And sure enough, it was. And Russia's 3-day war is now into its second year with no end in sight. I believe that 2023 will not be a year of peace. Neither side is ready to talk. Both sides still think they can win. Ukraine is on the front foot and has the momentum after 2 successful counterattacks late last year around Kharkiv and also Kherson in the south. Meanwhile, Russia is finalizing and is putting in place its mobilization, large-scale mobilization that has started last fall. Apparently, it's about 300,000 new troops. Who knows if we can believe these numbers? But let's say it's half that, and then let's say only half of that half are actually trained properly and get to the front lines. We're still talking about 75,000 troops. So Russia still thinks that they have a shot to meet some of their objectives. So 2023 will not be a year of peace. The 3 areas I say we need to watch in 2023 will be around Bakhmut in the east. We don't know really what's happening there right now. As far as we know, this city has finally been captured by the Russians. The Ukrainian defensive lines are about 18 miles further to the west from Bakhmut. If Ukraine withdraws tactically and moves to these defensive lines, it's likely Russia could keep up the momentum because they've been trying to capture this small town for several months now and at a great cost. But it's a very chaotic situation, and we don't know really what's going on there. The second place we need to keep an eye on in 2023 is in the south, a city called Melitopol, which I believe Ukraine will make its primary objective this year in order to cut the land bridge that connects the Russian Federation to occupied Crimea. Melitopol is already in the range of many of Ukraine's long-range rocket systems. And from the people I speak to and from what I'm seeing in open source reporting, it is likely this will be Ukraine's main effort this year if they can stabilize the situation around Bakhmut. And then the third place to keep an eye on is with Belarus. Russia's already tried once to take the capital from Belarus. There's a big question mark what Russia might try again, if the armed forces of Belarus might participate this time, which I think would probably be a very bad decision, but it wouldn't be the first bad decision that Lukashenko has made. And but just threatening the capital or just threatening the supply lines in Western Ukraine from Belarus could be enough to force the Ukrainians to pull back desperately needed forces on the front lines in the east and the south to come back and defend the capital or to expel another invasion into Western Ukraine. And that could cause problems for Ukraine itself. The war in Ukraine has consequences for us here in the United States. Often you hear these consequences and the explanations on why it matters framed in very lofty, idealistic ways. We hear, for example, the president talk about a threat to the rules-based order. We hear about this is a fight of good versus evil. All of these could be true. It is a fight against good versus evil. Last November, I visited Bucha. I saw the sites of the mass graves, and you can't describe what happened there in any other way but evil. But when you go to an American taxpayer, where I'm from in the Midwest, and you say, well, we have to invest in Ukraine because of the rules-based order, they look at you like you're crazy. They don't even know what that means. I don't even really know what that means, right? So we have to start framing why Ukraine matters in a way and using words that people can understand. And I think there are three main reasons why stability in Europe and Russia's invasion of Ukraine matter to Americans. And the first one is the economics behind it. The stability and security that Europe has experienced, or relative security and stability that Europe has experienced since the end of the Second World War, has created a level of economic prosperity that has not only benefited the Europeans, but also the United States. The Transatlantic community, so North America and Europe together, account for about 45% of the global economy. We're each other's number one source of foreign direct investment. We're each responsible for the creation of millions of jobs on either side of the Atlantic. The transatlantic community has some big spenders, which drives economic activity. 50% of global private consumption is found between North America and Europe. Meanwhile, India and China combined only accounts for 14% of private consumption. So we're big spenders, but crucially, we're each other's number one export partner. 45 out of 50 states export more to Europe than they do to China, including our largest Pacific-facing country, California. So right now, Vladimir Putin is trying to undermine that stability and security that we've enjoyed in Europe that has brought economic prosperity, not just to Europeans, but also to Americans. Because when we talk about the exports, when we are exporting a product or providing a service, that's an American building something or providing a service for something, and that's a job. So we cannot take for granted the stability and security in Europe and how that impacts the economics. The second reason we should care about Ukraine is actually because of China. You often hear this argument that, well, Taiwan should be the main focus, Ukraine is a distraction, Russia is a distraction, China is our main geopolitical adversary. What these people who argue this fail to understand is that Russia and China are figuratively two sides of the same coin. Literally, they're two sides of the same landmass. And Russia is China's junior partner. So anything we do to weaken Russia indirectly weakens China. And anything we do to strengthen Ukraine and make Ukraine victorious will indirectly make Taiwan safer. We can't differentiate between these two geopolitical challenges because there's so much overlap and so many connections. I'm not saying that the Chinese have military planning cells in Moscow, but We have heard in the news recently about this concern about China providing munitions and other military hardware to Russia. I could almost guarantee they've been providing non-lethal aid to Russia. But crucially for Russia, Beijing and Moscow has come to some sort of accommodation or agreement that allows Russia to feel comfortable enough to empty out its eastern military district so those soldiers can go fight in Ukraine in a way that is historically unprecedented. So if Russia feels comfortable doing that in an area, in a region of Russia that historically has had a lot of tension with China, then that tells me there's more than what meets the eye in that relationship. And then finally, it's the degrading of Russia's conventional armed forces that is in our interests to support Ukraine for. U.S. military support to Ukraine to date during this war amounts to about $31 billion for just the military support. $31 billion. That's money out the door. Equipment, everything out the door. That's money that actually doesn't go to Ukraine. It actually stays here in the United States and fuels the defense industry and creates very good, high-paying, high-tech jobs in the defense sector. But it's about $31 billion. That works out to about 25 cents per American per day. It's less than 0.1% of our national GDP, and it's 3.2% of our fiscal year 2023 defense budget. So for that 25 cents a day per American, we're getting the dismantling of Russia's conventional armed forces. Now, we never know exactly what the battlefield assessments truly are or how much damage has been caused because we just don't know, right? No one's sharing accurate information. Both sides probably deflate or inflate the figures depending on what suits the narrative. But because of this day and age of open source intelligence, there's all these internet sleuths that comb hours of TikTok and Telegram posts. And we have a pretty good idea what Russia has lost since February of 2022. There's one website in particular that's called Oryx, and if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you check Oryx out. Put it into Google, Oryx Ukraine, you can find it. And this team of open source intelligence analysts will document every single major loss for Ukraine and Russia using photographic or video evidence. So if they say a T-72 tank was destroyed, they put a link to a social media post, for example, that will show that tank destroyed. According to what they report, Russia has lost more than 9,400 major pieces of equipment since the war started. And this includes almost 1,900 main battle tanks, 3,000 armored fighting vehicles and infantry fighting vehicles, 74 jets and other planes, 78 helicopters, and 12 ships, including the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. And that's considering that Ukraine really doesn't even have a navy. So for that 25 cents a day, we are able to dismantle the conventional armed forces of one of our major geopolitical adversaries without a drop of American blood being spilt. And the Ukrainians will often remind us Americans that it's they who are fighting, it's not us who's fighting. So this is not another forever war for America. It's the Ukrainians who are sacrificing and the Ukrainians who are fighting every single day. They just want a fighting chance, a sporting chance to defend themselves. So how has Russia's invasion changed the geopolitical dynamics of the transatlantic community? I think there are a number of reasons, and I'll run through them and then conclude my remarks this evening. The first is that it's really solidified and rallied support around a common cause inside the European Union, inside NATO, in ways completely unimaginable just 18 months ago. It's also created a feeling of boldness and creativity on taking responsibility for security in the transatlantic region. Just think, this time last year, we were still having a debate on how many javelins and other anti-tank weapons we could send to Ukraine. Think where we are now. We're now sending Challengers and Abrams and other main battle tanks to Ukraine, right? So we've found some self-confidence, I think, as a transatlantic community on defending and sticking up for what we believe is right. For the most part, we have seen an increase in defense spending and investments across Europe. Not every country has pledged more. Some countries that pledged more at first are now doing a little less, but on balance, defense spending across Europe is increasing. And in fact, defense spending across Europe started to increase with Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and has increased year on year, and it's now in overdrive, I would say. However, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed major shortcomings in military readiness and in our defense industrial base. There are some European countries who wanted to provide some equipment to Ukraine, but when they looked into their stockpiles, they realized that, well, because of years of underinvestment and lack of maintenance, this stuff isn't ready for combat. I actually think that's one of the reasons why the debate about main battle tanks coming from Germany lasted so long, because I don't think it would have exposed the lack of readiness that the German armed forces had, because they didn't have the tanks that were ready for combat to give to Ukraine. They had to get them up to speed. And then with the shortage of munitions and missiles and the impact on the defense industrial base, it's been felt on both sides of the Atlantic, including here in the US. But let me tell you, thank God we are realizing these shortcomings and these problems now when we're not the ones in a shooting war, so we can work out the kinks, figure out what needs to be done to get our defense industrial base back on track. There's also been a radical shift in Europe's energy security, which I understand will be a topic of discussion at the next event. But we now have Europeans diversifying away from Russia, looking at other regions of the world. Just a few weeks after Russia's invasion, you had a high-level EU delegation signing deals in Baku, expanding the capacity of the Southern Gas Corridor, looking to North Africa, looking to US LNG exports. And we now have a situation where Europe's starting to get into a pretty good place with its energy mix away from Russia. There's a temptation, I think, by some European countries to look towards Iran, trying to play nice with Iran, but I think this would be an error in the long run. But I think overall, with the mild winter we've had, right now, Europe is doing just okay with energy. I think perhaps next winter could be the big challenge, but this winter we seem to be doing okay. There's also been what I call a disappearance of any of the anxieties that Europeans had over Britain's role in European affairs post-Brexit. Before February 24th, it was still common to go to conferences and hear panel discussions about Britain's role in Europe now that they've left the EU. And I think what Russia's invasion of Ukraine did and what Britain's response did during the lead up to this invasion and in the aftermath of this invasion reminded everyone that Britain has been a continental power for centuries, and it'll be a continental power for centuries more, regardless of its membership status in the EU. And I've noticed now there's less discussion or almost no discussion or talk about Britain's role in Europe anymore because they have played such an important leadership role. And I think this is healthy for all sides to move on from the Brexit era and to look towards the future. This war is also, I think, put to bed, at least for the time being, this German-French idea of strategic autonomy, that the EU should be developing military tools and institutions to do more in European security without the United States. No one's seriously discussing strategic autonomy. I'm always hesitant to bring up strategic autonomy because if you ask 5 people what they think strategic autonomy is, you get 5 different answers. But I think this idea that Europe doesn't need the United States and can go it alone, I think is no longer something seriously being discussed. And in fact, I feel like the Russia's invasion of Ukraine has breathed new life, practical life, into the EU and CSDP when it comes to European security. I mean, who could have? I've been highly critical of CSDP running parallel to NATO structures, and in some cases duplicating NATO structures and discriminating against NATO allies. In the past, I've been very critical, but to give credit where credit is due, it would have been unimaginable 18 months ago to think that the EU Commission would be financing 3 billion euros worth of weapons for a non-member state during a major conflict in Europe. I mean, I think the EU is starting to find where it can really be of assistance and where it can really complement what NATO does to help encourage European security and stability. So I'll conclude here. What does the future hold? NATO is back, but NATO needs to get back to basics. It doesn't have to be everywhere in the world doing everything, but according to Article 6 of the 1949 North Atlantic Treaty, it must be, and I quote, in the North Atlantic area north of the Tropic of Cancer, able to defend its member states' territory. And I think we're starting to bring NATO back to its foundings and really focusing on the territorial defense aspect of the alliance. We should not fear a Russian defeat, and we should assume and plan that a Russian defeat, a Russian military defeat inside Ukraine could spark a chain of events around the borders of what we now know as the Russian Federation, and there could be second and third order effects of these major events that could happen inside Russia, whether it's a military coup, whether it's separatism, some subnational groupings calling for independence in light of a Russian military defeat inside Ukraine, the emergence of private military companies like the Wagner Group and the influence that these groups have inside Russian politics these days. We just don't know, and we need to prepare for it. And then finally, and I'll stop here, we have to start wanting Ukraine to win more than we just hope Russia's going to lose. And if we start thinking this way, if we start giving the Ukrainians the weapons they need to win, then they can win. I've never believed in this idea that Ukraine was going to get run over quickly by Russia. In all my writings going back years, you can find I've made the case that the Ukrainian armed forces after 2014 is so different from the Ukrainian armed forces before 2014, and they've never been more motivated or inspired to fight for their nation. And they know what will happen if they don't fight. If the Ukrainians stop fighting, they lose their country. If the Russians stop fighting, then the war stops. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Luke, for that. And the easy thing for me at this point is to simply say, everything he said, sit down, let's all go to dinner. But I think I'd probably get in a lot of trouble for doing that. So I'm going to try to pick up on a few points that you mentioned and add and perhaps push a little bit just to get a discussion started. So one point I think I want to focus here on is the sort of critical element of time. I often like to say the political clock and the policy clock sometimes work at different speeds. And I think we're kind of getting to that, right? Here we are a year into this with a war settling into a near stalemate. And there are a lot of questions about how this ends, right? And what it's going to cost to get to a settlement. And I know the figure you just mentioned, 31 million. That's true on military aid, but I think if you add everything together, right, the U.S. is spending about a little over $7 billion a month. Now, if you think about the burn rate of that over the course of a year, that's $100 billion. Now, granted, that's a small part of our defense budget. Per person, it's still a small amount. But I think this is why you're starting to hear this sort of discussion out there of, it is support, but it's not a blank check. And you hear that term over and over again. So that tells me that politically, even if the policy clock is running at one speed, the political clock in terms of what is feasible is running at a different speed, and we have to be aware of that. So I'm kind of putting on my sort of grumpy realist hat here and kind of giving you this assessment. I want to stress it's not necessarily what I want or what I think should happen. My personal perspective is that I would argue that we should be, in fact, increasing Western aid. And we should be increasing it in a way that enables Ukraine, as you said, to have a comprehensive military win, right? And right now we've been focused on essentially giving them what's enough to defend themselves, but not really giving them enough to quite push this thing to the end. We may be getting closer and closer to that, but it's been little steps here and there. And the reality is, I think, is that there are risks that many states don't want to take. and across most of Europe, with the exception of the Baltic states and Poland. And even in the United States, you'll notice that there is reluctance and caution about supplying Ukraine with too much of what can be deemed offensive weapons, right? Or offensive weapons of a certain category that might inflame tensions and lead to something broader. I personally, like you, don't believe that that broader conflict is in the cards, but nonetheless, it has instilled quite a lot of political caution, and we've seen it in these different arms transfers that have been slowed down or modified at different times. All right, so logically, if we are politically going to find it difficult to pursue a policy of indefinitely spending on what is proving to be a stalemate, and at the same time, we're also not politically willing to spend and do what it takes to finally put this war to an end with a Ukrainian victory, you're going in a different direction. And I think we are politically starting to see that occur already in Europe. So Germany, France, and Great Britain, once again bringing Great Britain back into the UK into the sort of European security circle, have put forward essentially a proposal with NATO. They've been sort of ballooning this around to see how people take to it, which would give Ukraine sort of a super partner status with NATO in exchange for Ukraine trying to start negotiations involving potentially territorial concessions with Russia. I expect that over time, we're going to see more of this kind of Western pressure on Ukraine to make some concessions, even if they don't really have an interlocutor on the Russian side, and I don't believe they do right now. I also think the EU is going to start using its leverage with holding out the carrot of membership for Ukraine here on this point. They have made big steps in committing to bring in Ukraine as a member state of the European Union. That is huge, right? But the reality is this: you cannot bring in a state into the European Union that has a territorial conflict with Russia, right? That's simply a non-starter. You can't, for that matter, bring in a state that has a territorial conflict with Russia into NATO, right? Once again, that has to be resolved somehow for Ukraine to start to move forward. So I think we can expect more Western pressure on Ukraine to formally cede parts of, unfortunately, Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea to Russia, with the promise of EU membership for this smaller Ukraine and security guarantees, either through NATO or in some other structure. I think that's also likely to be a point of broad transatlantic agreement. And I want to sort of stress something that Luke has just mentioned here, which is, in all of my time working this, 7 years in Brussels, my time in Washington, D.C., I have never seen this level of coordination, cooperation, and like-mindedness across the transatlantic relationship. It's really been quite extraordinary. So this has galvanized people, and that's a good thing. And I think here, the sense that in the United States, yes, the current administration is extremely supportive of Ukraine, and certainly vocally in public, we'll do whatever it takes, and that is true. But the private discussions have also raised this question of, yes, we're very supportive. Yes, we appreciate what is happening. Yes, we will do what it takes. But it's not a blank check, right? That same term has come up. And, so I think we're going to have to, just deal with this basic reality that there's less support across Europe and the United States for taking actions that are potentially highly risky that might enable a Ukrainian military, a decisive military victory, but there just isn't the appetite for that. And there's increasingly perhaps less support on the clock as you run through 2023 for a commitment to what is proving to be an indefinite stalemate. So that makes this increased European, American pressure on Ukraine to start to find a way to try to settle this, right? To start to put that out there on the table through territorial concessions, a more likely option than not, right? I'm not going to say it's going to happen. I'm just saying that I think things are moving in that direction politically. That's where the gravity is. This is, once again, not my personal preference, right? This is not what I would advocate. This is just how I sort of see the political wind shifting. And this is certainly not a heroic end to the situation, right? But it is one that sets Ukraine on a path to long-term economic and political stability if this comes with the promise of membership in Euro-Atlantic institutions, right? If we can get that out of this bargain, it might be worth it. It does, however, absolutely potentially reward Russia for its aggressive actions and, as you pointed out, undermining, what we might call the liberal international order. But the reality is, and this is another ugly reality we should acknowledge, we have tacitly done that in the past already. We did that in Georgia and South Ossetia. We did that in Abkhazia. We did that in 2014. So this is simply the latest step in what Russia has been doing, whether we want to call it Russia or the collapsing remnants of the Soviet Union, which I think is actually an excellent way to think about this. That's what we've tolerated so far. And so if you can engineer a situation where over the next year we see a settlement or the beginnings of a settlement that does grant Russia some formal territorial gains, but are distinctly less than what they already de facto had in 2014, right? That should act as a deterrent to any other challenger that might think about doing this in the future, given the enormous losses that Russia has suffered. I mean, you mentioned the equipment losses, which are tremendous to the Russian military. But think about the personnel losses as well, right? I have seen estimates of 100,000 casualties, possibly up to 50,000 dead, right? That is huge, right? And it's having a tremendous negative impact on Russian society, cascading through it. So all of this could be very ugly and very unsatisfying, but it may be politically viable, and it may enable Ukraine to start to rebuild as a European state tied into European and transatlantic institutions, and that may be the outcome which is broadly beneficial to peace and security in Europe. And at this point, I think we can safely say that if nothing else, the outcome of this past year has been that Russia is a far, far weaker military adversary. I mean, as you pointed out, just the discretion to their military, but also the realization that we now have within NATO and the rest of the Western states that Russia is a weak player, right? Not just economically, but in fact militarily. And at the same time, as I mentioned before, transatlantic unity and unity between NATO and the European Union is really at an all-time high. So this has been a huge strategic loss, as it is for Russia. Right? The question is, can we get to some kind of settlement that puts an end in this and actually starts to allow Ukraine to put this behind them and rebuild in a way that integrates them into Europe, frankly, in a way in which they should be. So I think I will stop there, and then we can take questions from the audience.
Between the two of us, we must have sparked some sort of debate.
I'm hoping, yeah. Something.
Thank you both for your remarks. Just quickly, I'll remind folks at home, you can submit a question through the little bubble in the lower part of your screen. I'm actually going to use host privilege to ask the first question, and either one of you can answer this. And I actually have two questions. One is, Putin has threatened the use of nuclear weapons, which has obviously, I think, led to some measure of the restraint. So I would be interested in your thoughts on that. And then the second question, to what extent do you think the heating up presidential politics in the United States are also going to play a role in sort of the pressures that may or may not exist to be exerted on Ukraine to push for negotiations here?
Great. On the first one, we hear this all the time, and I think we forget that we also have a nuclear deterrent. And I don't think Russia will just very cavalierly decide to use nuclear weapons without considering the ramifications of doing so. That's on the strategic level. On the tactical level, you do hear this concern about Russia using tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield. I've heard this from Ukrainians as well. On this point, I still think that's unlikely. Can't rule it out, can't rule anything out, but I think it's unlikely. and I don't think it would have a material impact on Ukraine's will to continue fighting. When you look at some of the places where Russia's been with conventional forces, minus the radiation, you can't imagine how it could be worse, right? And I'm not an expert on Russian military doctrine with the use of tactical nuclear weapons, but from what I understand and from what I've read and discussed with people, it is in fact in their doctrine to use tactical nuclear weapons, or even nuclear weapons for that matter, in a conventional war to, they call it to escalate to de-escalate,
yeah.
right? But on the use of tactical nukes, this is done when you're winning on the battlefield already, and then the tactical nuke is used to like be the final push across the finish line to get your adversary to the negotiating table. Clearly, Russia's not on the front foot right now. And the final point on this is to operate in a NBC, a nuclear, biological, chemical warfare environment, takes a certain level of skill and training and equipment that I think that the Russian forces probably lack. I remember as a young soldier just going to the rifle range wearing my full chemical setup. I mean, try shooting a rifle when it's like 100 degrees outside and you have that the whole like gloves, rubber boots, head to toe covering. It's hard to do, and to like do small unit tactics and procedures on the battlefield while wearing all of that stuff. I don't think Russia has the training or the ability to operate in that sort of environment, because they would then have to operate as well in that environment, at least in the short term. On the point about the presidential debate, the presidential campaign and the debate we'll be having about Ukraine, I think really the main focus is on the right, on what the Republican candidates will do. I think you'll see some take the full-blown nationalist point of view, saying this is none of our business, why are we screwing with it? I think you'll have some people already saying this is in our interest, we have to support the Ukrainians, it's in our interest that they win against Russia. And you'll have some people, one person in particular I'm imagining that many of you might be familiar with, who I, from what I gather, knowing people around him, instinctively would be supportive of Ukraine's right to self-defense, but will probably be walking a tightrope politically until that person might or might not win the primaries. And then if they get the candidacy, then you probably will see a more mainstream view on this. But for what it's worth, I believe that those on the Republican side, on the right, who are against support to Ukraine, U.S. support to Ukraine, I think this is predominantly a very online phenomenon that's driven by a small group of very vocal opponents who are mainly found on Twitter. And inside the Beltway or inside our little like Twitter sphere, we get all worked up about it. But when I go to red states, when I'm home in Missouri, I see Ukrainian flags flying. I've been fly fishing in the Shenandoah in places where I don't even have a cell phone signal, and I see Ukrainian flags flying. I think Americans instinctivly like supporting the underdog, and we like sticking it to Russia when we can. So I think broadly speaking, there's still strong bipartisan support among the huge middle ground to continue supporting Ukraine.
Thank you very much for your presentations. A lot to think about. I have two questions, one very quick. My first question, you talked about kind of consequences of this and implications with relationship with China, for example. I have a question about another highly aggressive country to the south, which is Iran,
Yeah.
and kind of the prospect of weak Russia offering kind of a solution to the question of Iran, because it's quite clear that in a shape and form it exists today, it's just a matter of time before we have another war or another case of aggression roughly in that region. And my second question is about what do you think military aid should look like? Because even half a year ago, maybe more, tanks were a big no. Right now, there are people, and like obviously pro-Ukrainian people, are still thinking that tanks may not be a wise solution to this, because first of all, of high maintenance and just cost of getting them there, and second, because this is largely an artillery duel by now. So what do you think should be the next step in aids? Are we going to see F-16s this year? Should we see F-16s? Thank you.
Yeah, great. On your first question, regardless of one's views on whether or not the JCPOA, the Iran deal, the Joint Comprehensive JCPOA, whatever, it's been a while, agreement, whatever, the Iran deal, the JCPOA, regardless of one's views on whether you think that this was good or not, whether Trump should have left it or not, or whether Biden was right to say he would like to renegotiate a deal with Iran, at this point, considering everything we know about what Iran is doing to enable Russia's continued air campaign against Ukraine, I find it unbelievable that we would even consider talking about the nuclear issue with Iran at this point. I mean, in practical terms, the talks in Vienna are dead. For the P5+1, or I guess for this format, I should say the E3+3 format, Russia was the main interlocutor for us when talking with Iran. The talks in Vienna were indirect talks basically through Russia. The idea that Russia is a trustworthy actor in these talks, or Iran is a trustworthy actor, I think at this point is nonsensical. In fact, because of the way Iran has given Russia these drones and enabled the Russian military to continue its air campaign against Ukraine, I think we have to start thinking about the implications for this in the region. And I would even go so far as to say that we have to start thinking about NATO's Black Sea frontier being like the southern shore of the Caspian. Not like in an Article 5 sense or anything like that, but Russia certainly sees a connection between the Caspian and Iran and enabling its invasion of Ukraine. It's not just the Iranian drones that use the Caspian to get up to Russia and then onto Ukraine, but the Caspian flotilla is now the only source of reinforcements for the Russian Black Sea Fleet since Turkey closed the straits. And we know that Kalibr cruise missiles have been fired from the Caspian from a relative safety and distance from Ukraine, so participating in the war that way. So we have to start. The Caspian is a geopolitical black hole to U.S. policymakers. We have to at least show up. The last time a Secretary of State has visited Baku, for example, was 2012, Hillary Clinton. I mean, that's a long time ago. We just have to be more aware of what's going on with Iran and the region. On your question about what types of weapons, are tanks worth it? Should we do F-16s? What about artillery? All the above. Again, my view is we have to want Ukraine to win more than we just hope Russia's going to lose. And I agree with Zach that depending on how this year goes, you could see a situation where some Western powers start putting pressure on Kyiv. But I can tell you, everyone likes a winner. And if Ukraine is, if it does capture Melitopol, if it can hold the line in Donetsk, if it can threaten the bases in Crimea, I think it'll change the political calculation in the West on what is achievable. Because if we do push Ukraine to some sort of negotiated settlement, it sets a very dangerous precedent in the North Atlantic community that you can use force to annex someone else's territory. So I do believe we should be providing tanks. I do believe we should be providing F-16s. I do believe that we should be, the appetite for 155 millimeter artillery rounds is great. We should be providing as many artillery rounds as we can. We should upping our production on this. And we should have started this months ago. But again, we were too scared of a Russian defeat. We didn't want Ukraine to win. We just wanted them to survive. One thing I've been advocating for months now, from early last summer, was a program that I call Train Today for Tomorrow. We should be training the Ukrainians on all the platforms we think that they might need Even if we don't have any plans at the moment to give them an F-16, we should be training them on an F-16. Even if we don't think they will ever have Patriots, we should be training them on Patriots. Because now in November, it was announced we're giving them Patriots, but guess what? You have to wait 4 or 5 months for the Ukrainians to train on them. And so we need to start thinking boldly. And also I think this could send an important message to Russia that we are committed to helping Ukraine defend itself and to win on the battlefield. On the final point about, your point about how complex the tanks, the logistics and all this, I think one of the things we've done from the very beginning is underestimate the innovative spirit of the Ukrainians. I mean, these people are fighting for their national survival, and I don't think maintenance and logistics are going, while it might cause a problem, I don't think it's an insurmountable roadblock to them using advanced equipment. In fact, everything we've seen so far is that they can quickly learn how to use these complex pieces of equipment very effectively. On one hand, they're using the HIMARS very effectively. On the other hand, they buy a drone, presumably off like Amazon in Western Europe, have it sent to Ukraine, attach a $25 grenade, and some like 19-year-old kid wearing VR glasses drops it down the hatch of a Russian T-72 tank from about 100 feet and destroys $1 million tank. So I think across the board, we've underestimated the Ukrainians and their will and their desire to fight.
We do have an online question. What does the complete collapse of, here it says Soviet Union in reference to your comments, due to the international order, should that actually play out that way?
Yeah, this is very difficult issue to forecast and predict, and very well may not happen. Who knows how the Russian Federation will emerge from all of this, how Vladimir Putin will emerge from all of this. I'm also mindful of the sensitivities around this issue, because if you talk about preparing for the collapse of the Russian Federation, you're branded a warmonger and you're calling for regime change. I'm not calling for regime change. I think this would be a matter for the Russian people to decide. But if you don't talk about it and you don't prepare for it, and then it happens, then you're part of the expert class that got it wrong again, right? So it's a difficult issue to discuss. But I'm very happy to plan and discuss it, because I think it would be geopolitical negligence not to consider this possibility, because look how quickly it happened in the late 1980s when we saw the fragmentation of the Soviet Union and the breakup of the USSR. There are a lot of assumptions, I think, that can be made when we think about what a post-Putin Russia could look like. Some of these assumptions are there'll be calls for self-determination and perhaps independence in certain regions of Russia. How do we respond to these in a way that are in America's interest and also in line with international law and norms? We should start thinking about this now. We should assume that there'll be tens of thousands of young men disproportionately from ethnic minority groups that will have combat experience and that will come home to not much. And how will that fuel the flames of separatism if Russia's militarily defeated in Ukraine? I think we have to think about what a collapse of the Russian Federation would mean in terms of Russia's influence in other parts of the world, in the Caucasus and in Central Asia. What will countries like China and Turkey do? And how can we harness that to our advantage? How can we deter it when we need to? I think there are a number of questions that we have to consider, and I just don't feel like we aren't having a discussion about this because we're too scared of a Ukrainian victory. And I think our policymakers need to at least privately start thinking about, well, what if this actually starts to unravel very quickly? What do we do about the weapons of mass destruction? What do we do about the flow of refugees out of Russia into neighboring countries? What do we do about internal fighting inside the Russian Federation that could spill over to our partners and allies in Europe and in Central Asia? I think it's responsible to think about this now.
Yeah, thanks for taking my question. I'm a little bit older, so I remember some things from way back that seem similar to today. 20 years ago, we invaded Iraq illegally and laid waste to that country. Now, supposing at that time Russia had supplied lethal aid to the Iraqis to kill Americans, would the Bush-Cheney administration has just stepped back and, like Putin has, and not retaliated directly against Russia for doing that? Now, also in 1990, Secretary of State James Baker promised Mikhail Gorbachev that he would not extend NATO into the Warsaw Pact countries. But of course, we lied. It's just like we lied to the Indians. That's why we're all white people here. And Putin has complained that NATO is trying to encircle and stifle stifle Russia, or just to threaten Russia by having weapons right on its border. Well, supposing Russia made a military alliance with Venezuela or Nicaragua or Cuba and put weapons there, wouldn't we invoke the Monroe Doctrine to stop that from happening? My question is, why is there one standard for Russian aggression and a different standard for American aggression?
Can I take part of that?
Yeah.
So, I mean, as someone who worked in the NATO world for a bit, let me try to pick up on part of your question. So, there was ever a time in which the United States or anybody promised the Soviet Union, well, Russia, that there would be no NATO enlargement. At that point in time, NATO enlarging in Eastern Europe wasn't even a thought, wasn't even considered. There were certain promises made about East Germany at that point in time, but that was a very particular situation. So you also have to understand that every country that has joined NATO or wants to join NATO is doing so because of sovereign decisions in those countries, right? Precisely because of the threats they feel most of the time from Russia, right? So they want to join an alliance that will protect them. And so our choices are, do we ignore those, right? And essentially say, no, Russia has a veto over your foreign policy. Or do you treat them as sovereign nations and say, yes, we'll talk. If you want to join and you meet the standards, we bring you in, right? And I think that's really the story of what's happened over this period of time. I mean, there's never an instance that I can think of when the United States or any NATO member country or NATO as an organization has gone to another state and said, you know, knock, 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 hey, you want to join? Here's a list of all the benefits. It's always the other way around. It's those countries coming to the organization, petitioning, working for years to build the credibility to be able to join. And so I think you have to think about it that way, right? Do you ignore them? And if you ignore them, what signal does that send, right? So that's, I think, the better way to take that. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, the difference between Russia and NATO or the EU when it comes to the issue of enlargement, the EU or NATO says, hey, if you want to join, this is what you need to do. Then as a collection of democracies, we'll decide whether or not we want you to join. And then you, as a democracy, should decide through your political process if you want to join. And when we all come to an agreement, then you join. From Russia's point of view, you're either in our sphere of influence in our world, or we're going to invade and partially occupy to keep you out of joining these Euro-Atlantic institutions. I mean, these people want to join NATO because they see the benefits and they see the threat, and they know the threat posed by Russia. And you know, normally I ignore these whataboutisms, but I'll bite tonight on comparing the situation with Iraq. The situation with Russia invading Ukraine and trying to legally annex huge chunks of that country is unprecedented in the 21st century and was last done in the 20th century when Saddam invaded Kuwait and annexed Kuwait. I think the two situations are completely different. But to continue with your logic of thinking here, I'll also say that it's possible for two things to be wrong. I think the invasion of Iraq, especially knowing what we know now, was a geopolitical disaster. I mean, it created the Middle East's only Shia majority Arab state that's now fully in line with Iran. It's emboldened Iran's influence in the region. It was a mistake. But it's okay for more than one thing to be bad at the same time. But I find it very difficult to like compare the two events as if they're similar, because they're just not. We're not annexing Basra.
Lethal aid to Iraq to fight the American invasion, like we're giving lethal aid to Ukraine to fight the Russian invasion. You can say, well, they're both bad, but we're talking about escalation and with a nuclear power.
Well, let's not forget, it was Russia that invaded Ukraine, not the other way around. Right? So it's not a proxy war. We didn't instigate this war with Russia. Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine's asking for assistance. I mean, Russia was giving bounties to the Taliban on dead American soldiers in Afghanistan. In the Cold War, we were helping the Mujahideen fight the Soviets. This is a very complex, messy world of geopolitics. But to say that just only one thing can be right and everything else is wrong, or America's always wrong and everyone else is always right, it's just, frankly, an unsophisticated approach to international affairs.
Next question.
I'll just get right to it. So talking about private military contractor groups, how's the prevalence of those groups, such as the American-based Blackwater or the Russian-based Wagner Group, affected either side of the Russian-Ukrainian war? And how will it affect conflicts in the future, especially with those relations between government and private military groups? And should governments utilize those private contractors more or less?
As far as I know, there are no U.S. private military companies operating in Ukraine, and I don't even think Blackwater exists as a legal entity anymore. Wagner is very much present in Ukraine and has been the main fighting force around Bakhmut, for example. You know, we saw the videos on social media of the recruitment of prisoners, and if you last 6 months, you get freed. And we also saw the first batch of graduates who lasted 6 months and were freed. But you know, the use of private military companies or in warfare, or mercenaries, or whatever you want to call them, and I know there's a legal distinction between all those groups, is something as old as warfare itself. And I think today we're just seeing the modern day manifestation of this through these private military companies.
Returning to kind of the point of kind of the crumbling of the Soviet Union and total victory for Ukraine in Ukraine, I think a topic that needs more discussion is kind of like how we're going to prevent weapons of mass destruction from going around and falling to the hands of separatist groups within Russia. So, in your ideal world, in a world where Ukraine wins total victory, how does the U.S. take steps to prevent weapons of mass destruction, and specifically nuclear weapons, from falling into the hands of breakaway groups within Russia?
I mean, when I say a Ukraine victory, my definition's fairly limited. I call it the full restoration of Ukraine's internationally recognized borders under Ukraine's control. But I think that there could be consequences if the Russian military is defeated in such a manner that would allow this. There could be consequences for the future of the Russian Federation. And the issue of weapons of mass destruction and accountability of these is a very important one. It's probably the most critical question that needs to be addressed, and I don't think there are any good answers to this. In parallel to this, in terms of the issue of proliferation of nuclear proliferation, I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine Ukraine combined with Iran's flirting with developing a nuclear weapon as a member of NPT. Let's not forget, Iran is a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, so it has obligations that it's not fulfilling. It has not decided to leave that treaty. It's a part of that treaty. So these two things combined probably means that no country in the world will ever give up nuclear weapons, definitely in our lifetime. And those countries who are like in the back of their minds thinking about developing nuclear weapons will think harder about that. Because of course Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in 1994 with the assurances that their borders would be respected. And obviously and Russia was one of the signatories of that agreement, and obviously that didn't happen. In terms of what can be done, I mean, we have no idea even if the Russian Federation will collapse or break up, and if it did, to what extent. I think it's a real possibility we have to consider, but things we could do now, and these are admittedly small steps, but they're better than doing nothing. We could start working with countries in the region on enhancing and improving even more than we already do their detection methods, especially at border cross points and border crossings around the region. I don't know if maybe there would have to be some sort of very generous buyback program where you get like a rogue Russian commander that gets a hold of some stuff and then he wants to get very wealthy and have a palace in Dubai or something, and maybe there can be something worked out. But these are purely hypothetical exercises at this point because we just don't know how or even if this would happen. But I agree with you, it's probably the $1 million question.
If I can just tack on to that. So when the Soviet Union at least had its first iteration of CLASS, depending on how to phrase that, we had a program put into place, a very large-scale U.S. aid program. This was the Nunn-Lugar program, or cooperative threat reduction, which first moved those nuclear weapons out of Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, but then also paid quite a lot to dismantle those weapons, dismantle the tactical nuclear weapons, put the components into secure storage, dismantle and destroy chemical weapons and biological weapons facilities to meet treaty commitments, and put in border crossings, right? So when you go around some of those border crossings between, in the South Caucasus and stuff, you will see these gleaming facilities which are built by the American government. Now, it's going to take a different kind of relationship with the Russian government to make that happen, right? We no longer have that trust in that relationship. So we would have to have some kind of successor government with whom we can work at some level, but there is a model there, there is a precedent.
I think this mic is on. I hope so.
It is.
All right. So my question is regarding the EU membership and the territorial concessions. I don't remember who made that point. I believe it was Dr. Selden. But so I was wondering what the timeline would be for that, the feasibility of that, as well as considering the type of recovery plan that maybe would take place following membership into NATO or the EU, and why there is risk aversion in potentially sending aid, but if there's a membership extension, wouldn't there be continued aid after the fact for recovery?
Sure. What I was talking about was the extension of more military specific aid and specifically offensive weapons. But you are starting to see this group of major European countries sort of pulling together and saying, hey, we need to have some kind of program looking into the future that tries to settle this, that's going to involve some kind of concessions and negotiation, and offering Ukraine sort of other carrots that sort of wed it closer to Western institutions. So I think when you start to see Germany and France and the UK coming together on that kind of program that tells you that the gravity in Europe is moving in a certain particular direction. My personal take is, I don't think Ukraine, with the best will in the world, right, will find an interlocutor in Russia with whom to have any kind of reasonable negotiation at this point, right? Something is going to have to shift and change. So while I see that pressure building in certain quarters in Europe, I don't see it necessarily being successful, barring some significant changes over the next year. Which is why me personally, I tend to support a somewhat more aggressive stance that would enable Ukraine to win back enough, because if you're negotiating those things from a position of strength, you're in a much better position, right? And I think that's must be part and parcel of this if it's going to work. So,
You got time for 2 more questions.
Yes, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us and answering our questions. I wanted to ask, recently the European Union has initiated or started their EU security compass, and one of those pillars is about partnerships, specifically partnerships between the EU, NATO, the United Nations, and other supranational entities. I wanted to ask, what role do you think this partnership is going to play in the future of international conflict over sovereignty, and how can this partnership look any different than what these institutions can do individually?
Do you want me to?
Sure.
There we go. Yeah.
Sure.
I take a lot of these with a grain of salt. I think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has done more to advance EU, NATO cooperation than all these other initiatives combined. There's always been institutional roadblocks to EU, NATO cooperation, and in some cases this has had a practical impact on a battlefield because of disputes between the Republic of Cyprus and Turkey. We've had certain agreements between NATO and the EU get blocked that would allow NATO to, help the EU. The EU policing mission in Afghanistan, for example, there was no agreement that, in place when there could have been. Operation Concordia, which was the NATO mission in Macedonia that transferred over to an EU mission, that actually was delayed at the time because of, again, another dispute between Cyprus and Turkey. And then let's not forget that there are so-called neutral members in the EU, which get, just from a neutrality point of view, get very cautious about any NATO cooperation, and they have a vote, they have a veto. But I think the urgency of the situation in Ukraine has kind of forced everyone to go above and beyond this. And there's probably never been greater institutional cooperation between NATO and the EU since February of 2022. But this also has implications for the idea that, if there are some territorial concessions, Ukraine could come into the EU. It's difficult from a treaty point of view because there's something called Article 42.7 of the Lisbon Treaty, and it doesn't quite roll off the tongue like Article 5, but it's like NATO's Article 5. It's like a solidarity clause. It's a collective defense clause. And this was actually one of the big issues in Ireland at the time when they were voting on whether or not to ratify the Lisbon Treaty. And depending on what sort of agreement or accommodation or makeup is made between Ukraine and Russia in this hypothetical notion of trading territory for EU membership, it could make that Article 42.7 difficult if a country's under partial occupation or under partial foreign control. Well, how does NATO play a role in that? Of course, you could look towards Cyprus maybe as a precedent for this, but even that's different because Cyprus was brought into the EU before any notion of an Article 42.7 type provision was in place. So there are a lot of institutional questions that really need to be addressed by both NATO and the EU as we go forward. And I'm not sure if these discussions are being had.
Last question.
Two questions, if you don't mind. One,
That's okay.
the prospect. What role do you think the prospect of Ukraine drilling oil within its boundaries resulted in Putin's decision to invade? And then two, we recently saw the leader of the Wagner Group criticize Russia and Putin openly on Telegram. So what do you think that cooperation looks like between them going forward? And does that have any effects on Wagner or Russia's other uses of Wagner in Africa?
Yep. I don't think the prospecting for oil or drilling oil had really any meaningful impact on Russia's decision to invade when it did for the second time. Annexing Crimea fully, brought in a lot of the oil and gas fields off the shore that now Russia thinks is theirs. So there is that component of it. We could have a whole conference on the importance of Crimea to both Ukraine and Russia and to the Black Sea and to the broader region. I believe it's always been it's been part of his plan to annex Crimea and then to go further into Ukraine for reasons, again, that could be a whole nother conference. In a nutshell, I think Putin sees Russia as a European country and not an Asian country. And without Russian control or influence over places like Ukraine and Belarus, then it's just merely an Asian country. It's not a European country. And I think that's part of his imperial worldview, that he feels like it's his obligation to get back some of these areas that were lost. On your point about the Wagner group and Prigozhin, the leader, the oligarch who's the leader of this, I think his criticism was at Shoigu, the defense minister. Perhaps he also criticized Putin, I don't know. All I know is this man is probably very frustrated because he's been trying to capture this relatively small town called Bakhmut for months, and he hasn't done so yet, although we don't know what the situation is like right now as we speak. It's a very precarious situation for Ukraine in that city. But this has come at a huge loss of life and almost a reputational blow to his private military company. So there must be internal polis intrigue taking place over this fact. But one of the assumptions that I think we should make when we talk about the possible breakup of the Russian Federation is the role that these private military companies will play. We often talk about these subnational groups like Chechens and Dagestanis and whatever else, like they're going to be playing a role, and they will probably. But there's been this proliferation of these groups, of these armed private groups. I feel like everyone is creating one. Gazprom has one. I even read that Shoigu, the defense minister, is creating his own private military company, which is curious in the extreme considering he's the defense minister. So everyone's like building these armed militia groups whose loyalty will be cash. So it is a very toxic situation, I think, because of that.
If I could,
Excellent. Well,
I was going to tack on one last point. I wouldn't make too big a deal out of Ukraine's energy resources that it's extracting domestically. I would put a much larger emphasis on American exports of energy, which have grown tremendously in the last 5 to 8 years, in such a way that when you look at what Europe's energy security world is now, right, and their ability to cut themselves off effectively from Russian energy, a significant amount of that substitution is coming from the United States, right, as well as elsewhere. But the U.S. is playing a huge role in that. That was not possible 8 or 10 years ago. And so that's the game changer, I think, when we start to think about global energy issues and European energy security. So,
fracking.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for the very good discussion. Thank you all for your questions and for attending tonight. This concludes the event. Please give our speakers a round of applause. Good evening.